Welcome back to Lavender Storytime, and today we will be reading Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. So without further ado, let's get started. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Miss Darcy of number 4 Privet Drive were very proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Darcy was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Miss Darcy was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time crawling over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Darcys had a son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that someone would discover it. They didn't think they could bear if anyone found out about the Potters. Miss Potter was Miss Darcy's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Miss Darcy pretended she didn't even have a sister because her sisters and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Darcy-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The neighbors would say Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Miss Darcy woke up on a dull grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest the strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Darcy hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Miss Darcy gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley in his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter by the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dudley picked up his briefcase and pecked Miss Darcy on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye but missed, because Dudley was just now having a tantrum as throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Darcy as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of the number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Darcy didn't realize what he'd seen. He jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he been thinking of? It must have been a trick of light. Mr. Darcy blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Darcy drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in the mirror. It was now reading a sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Darcy gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People with cloaks. Mr. Darcy couldn't bear any people who dressed in funny clothes. They get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eye fell on a hundred of these weirdos standing closely by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Darcy was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Darcy that these people were probably a silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Darcy arrived in the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Darcy sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If it hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed, open mouthed, as owls sped ahead. Most of them had never seen an owl. Even at nighttime, Mr. Darcy, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgot all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them in the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why or who made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting thing. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in his bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I've heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fears flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point worrying. Miss Darcy, she always gets upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Darcy realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked over to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he wasn't imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around the eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Miss Darcy had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Miss Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley had learnt a word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room in time to catch the last report of the day. Finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owl have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there are hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why these owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McCuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Views are far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised today, there'd be a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps we will have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I promise a wet night today." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Miss Darcy came into the living room, carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia dear, you haven't heard about your sister lately. So, like and subscribe and come back next time if you want to finish chapter 1 of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.